Every night my cat stares out my window tonight, I found out why. By Visual Truth 772. Every night, my cat, Lilith, perches on the windowsill, her eyes locked onto something outside that I can never seem to see. Nothing averts her gaze. Not people walking by, not the rustling of leaves. Even trying to touch her elicits no reaction. Nothing seems to deter her unwavering attention from the window. Lilith, for context, outside of this weird nightly ritual, is the most loving ragdoll cat you've ever seen. She's a little chatterbox who meows, purrs, and cuddles the day away. Come nighttime, her entire demeanor shifts into being unnerved. She sits still, not moving, just starting at the nothings that nighttime brings, until the early break of dawn, in which she resumes her normal demeanor, in which she curls up beside me, and falls asleep, soundly purring. I dismissed it as her staring at moths or small bugs, or even maybe the outdoor cats that live around our place, assuming I somehow don't notice them in the blanket of nightfall. Curiosity turned to concern when I noticed Lilith's behavior growing more intense. One night, the air felt unusually charged, and a bone-chilling silence descended upon the room. Lilith's eyes widened, reflecting an eerie luminescence from whatever unseen force captivated her gaze. Summoning courage, I joined her at the window, peering into the inky abyss. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual dimly lit surroundings. Then I noticed the rustling of a tree right by my window, and a silhouette of a person appeared. Curiosity got the best of me, and I sat peering at the figure. At first glance, I assumed that it was just some person drunk coming home from the bar that's a few blocks away, and that they somehow stumbled into our yard. Maybe even my neighbor's friend coming home late, given we have a shared outdoor space. But as the shadow grew closer, I felt my stomach sink, at the same time that my usually docile, goofy kitty started making a deep, guttural, growling sound. As the figure drew nearer, my blood turned to ice as her features became illuminated in the streetlight. Looking back at me from the other side of the glass was me. I stood there, transfixed by the spectacle before me. My doppelganger mirrored my movements, but its grin stretched unnaturally wide, sending shivers down my spine. Lilith, usually composed, hissed vehemently at the window, her fur standing on end as if sensing the sinister aura. Fear gripped me as I stumbled backward, breaking the unnerving connection. I jammed the blinds shut, but not before it raised its hand, breaking from the gimmick of mirroring me, and gave an unnerving wave. From that night on, I avoided the window, hoping to escape the haunting presence on the other side. Yet the air in the room remained heavy with an unspoken dread. I started sleeping in the living room, Lilith never wavering from her perch on my bed, staring out into the darkness at what I can only assume is my mirror image night after night. I didn't know who to tell. How can you explain that? My family would dismiss it as stress from work and life. Finally, I couldn't handle the nerves night after night, and I finally told my best friend, Lily. That night she stayed over. Lilith perched in her window spot as usual, and for the first time since I saw it, I peered through the blinds and saw it again. Jumping back, my best friend peered out the same window. "What? There's nothing there, are you okay?" She gave me a look that was mixed with concern and confusion. "What do you mean, can you not see it?" I looked back out, and the thing was laughing at me with that horrific, uncanny valley grin, and lifted its finger to its lips, making a shush motion. "It's RIGHT there," I shrieked. She glanced back out, and I averted my gaze to her. "Dude, there's nothing there." I glanced back out the window, and sure enough, whatever it was, wasn't there. Defeated, I suggested we go make some tea and try to watch a dumb show as a distraction. Watching TV, smoking a bowl, and a hot cup of tea later, my nerves had settled a bit. Maybe you've just been really stressed, not to sound like your parents, but your new job keeps you busy. And that with the lack of sleep, I don't know, maybe it's causing some sort of walking nightmare. Lily tried to soothe my fears, and after some back and forth and brainstorming, I started to settle into the idea that maybe it is all stress and trauma-induced. The idea actually gave me some peace. Then, at midnight on the dot, a low, guttural scratching emanated from the window. My best friend jumped, and we exchanged a look of fear. Dread settled in the pit of my stomach as we cautiously approached the window in my room. Lilith, her eyes wide with alarm rather than on her usual perch, cowered in the corner. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a haunting whisper that seemed to carry my own voice, distorted and twisted. "Let me in," it murmured, the words sending a shiver down my spine. "Okay, I heard that. What the fuck?" my best friend exclaimed. With trembling hands, I opened the curtains. My doppelganger was back, still grinning, pressed its hands against the glass, the barrier the only thing keeping it from entering my world. "Oh, fuck, is that you?" Lily whispered, her pupils dilating in fear. With every ounce of strength, I resisted the impulse to unlock the window, to scream at it, to do anything to end this nightmare. My heart pounded as the sinister figure outside became more desperate, its grin contorting into a snarl. Lilith, sensing the imminent threat, hissed louder, her fur bristling as she fled her corner spot, and bravely positioned herself defensively between us and the window. In a swift motion, shoved the curtains closed. I grabbed Lily's hand and booked it out of the room. Still hearing the scratching and whispers, turned to screaming and pounding on the glass. So sure that at any moment the glass would give way and let whatever that thing is into my home. As the night wore on, the pounding and yelling reduced back to scratching and whispers that eventually faded away with the daybreak. For the next few weeks, I stayed with Lily and hired movers to get my stuff out and back to my parents. I haven't heard or seen anything like what I did at my old place since. Lilith has resumed sleeping soundly by my side, seemingly having totally forgotten the horrors we all just went through. I'm writing this because I just moved into my new place, and once everything was unpacked and things were settled, it was just Lilith and I again. We were left alone in the oppressive silence, haunted by the realization that at any time my doppelganger, with its twisted grin, could be patiently awaiting its next opportunity to break through and confront me with a malevolence I couldn't comprehend. And Lilith has been giving concerned, passing looks at the window as the evening moved in today. I took a mobster deep-sea fishing and almost got buried at sea. By giraffe goodness. I used to run a fishing boat for charter out of Cape Cod. People would come from all over to rent my boat and spend the day pulling in all kinds of fish. They'd pull in flounder, black sea bass, mackerel, mahi-mahi, swordfish, and even sharks. I would always pilot the boat so the customers could focus on getting their reels, nets, and various fishing equipment set up and ready to go when we got to my usual fishing spot. I'd often drop anchor, head below deck, and catch a nap while the fishing went on. Usually, I'd take out small groups of friends and sometimes families. Once in a while, I'd have only a couple of friends rent the boat, and on rare occasions, I'd have someone go out alone to fish. It was on one of those trips when I had the creepiest customer of my life. He looked like some kind of mobster, short, stocky, with dark curly hair and a mustache. He had a round nose and a scar that ran across his face from just below his left eye, across his upper lip, and ending just next to the right side of his mouth. He wore a blue baseball jacket and spoke with a heavy Bostonian accent. He brought on a huge cooler with over 100 pounds of chum in it. He was after sharks, and chum is chopped up meat used to attract them to the area, where you can then hook them with your reel. You just dump it in the water, and the sharks can smell it, supposedly from miles away. He had a rod and reel that I recognized as professional grade for sport fishermen, which was fully capable of catching sharks up to 800 pounds. Once on board, he'd have to use my crane to hoist it up and on board. On the way out, the man kept staring at me with his cold, dead eyes. The expression and gaze he possessed were unsettling and actually made me slightly paranoid. I had never before encountered someone like that, someone whose very presence made my skin crawl. He kept coming up behind me in the wheelhouse while I was at the helm. He'd just stand there saying nothing. In one instance, I turned around unexpectedly and caught him quickly, whipping his hand behind his back as if concealing something from my view. Then he just grinned at me. Eventually, we got to the coordinates where I stopped the boat, dropped anchor, shut the engine off, and headed down into my cabin. I told the man if he needed anything to knock on my cabin door. Once inside, I locked the door and quickly found my gun, which I placed within reach just in case. I drifted off to sleep and woke suddenly to the sound of the door to my cabin hitting up against the stopper on the wall. I lifted my head up, and the man was hovering over me with a grin on his face. I asked how he had gotten into my room. He claimed the door was unlocked. He said he was ready to go back to shore. He had dumped his chum in the water, and it had failed to attract any sharks. I thought this was odd, but frankly, I was glad to get rid of him early. I told him I'd be right up. He left my room and went topside. I checked the door to my cabin on the way out, and it had marks on it that made it apparent that it had been jimmied. I was mad, but I wasn't going to risk getting into a scuffle with this man. I'd taken his money, and now I just wanted to get back to shore myself. The ride back was worse than the trip out. He was pacing and writhing his hands and glaring at me the whole time. It was strange. Several times I thought for sure that he was planning to kill me. I went to take a pee at one point and checked my cabin for my gun while I was down there. It was gone. He had taken my pistol. I decided to act like I didn't know and go back to the helm. From there, I would keep my flare gun in hand and keep my eye on him. He saw me holding the flare gun, and his demeanor changed. He started acting more friendly. I dropped him off at the dock and luckily picked up another client right then and there. I dumped his gear on the dock and helped the next customer load up. I disembarked without saying a word to the man. I took my new customer back to the same spot. Maybe the other man's chum would produce results. Later that afternoon, he did indeed pull in a shark. We hoisted it up and into the boat. I always help my customers clean their fish and pack them in ice upon our return. While we were gutting the shark, a police officer approached us. He explained that there was a manhunt going on for a mob thug who was wanted for murder. He had abducted a woman the previous day, and there were witnesses. They hadn't found the body yet, but they had made flyers with the man's face on it, and he wanted me to take a look in case I saw him. Just then, the shark's stomach accidentally got cut into as we cleaned the creature, and its breakfast spilled out. It consisted of a female human's hand among other body parts. I was shocked, as was the cop. I looked over at his wanted poster, and my hair stood on end at what I saw. It was the same man I'd taken fishing earlier. Then it hit me. The chum he was using was his victim's body. He'd found a clever way to dispose of the evidence. It's a good thing I had that flare gun, or I might have been with her in the belly of that beast. I was asked to babysit a washing machine by the Eagle Strikes. Pardon? I responded incredulously. 200 pounds per hour, Susan repeated. Yeah, I replied. But you said I'd be babysitting, no? I must have misheard you. Where's the child? Child? Stephen laughed. We don't have children. You heard me correctly, George. Just watch the machine for a few hours, Susan said. That's all, isn't it, Stephen? Indeed. Susan, Stephen chuckled. Honestly, this new generation. You'd think they could handle babysitting a washing machine, wouldn't you? You would. Susan laughed. Perhaps we should write it on a piece of paper for him? He probably needs to be told through the medium of TikTok, Stephen said. The pair of them laughed, and I stifled the irritated huff that was itching to emerge from my tightly compressed lips. They were insufferable, but 200 pounds per hour of babysitting was a staggering offer. It would have been staggering if I'd been offered that much to care for an actual person. But a washing machine? Let them have their fun, I thought. I was certain I'd have the last laugh. And so, I bit my tongue. "No," I said, smiling. "I think I've got it." "Good lad," Stephen said, ruffling my hair in a patronizing fashion. "May I take your coat?" I shrugged, but Stephen had already slipped it off my shoulders before I could respond. He disappeared upstairs, which seemed a little peculiar, given they had a coat stand by the door. But I didn't question it. "We'll see you at 11 o'clock. Okay?" Susan asked. I nodded, waving as they left. I lifted a middle finger as soon as the door had shut behind them. I was about to make the easiest 800 pounds of my life. Maybe more if they stay out longer, I thought. Stephen and Susan Hall had always been the oddballs of the street. Nobody really knew them. And, despite their insistence to the contrary, I could have sworn they had kids Tim and Rachel. Mom and Dad seemed to think not. Which is, they were confused when the Halls offered me the babysitting gig over the Christmas break. When I found myself eyeballing a washing machine in their kitchen, I started to realize that my parents were probably right. There had never been a Tim or a Rachel. But I wasn't complaining about the bizarre request. As a broke university student, the thought of making eye-watering money in a single night had me salivating in seconds. As soon as the Halls popped around to make the offer, I rushed over to their house at the end of the street without another thought. Anyway, after that rude conversation with the Halls, I initially planned to not even bother babysitting the washing machine. But I was so glad I eventually peered through the oval window, because I was treated to a sight of unexpected hilarity. A mountain of miniature outfits circled the rumbling drum. There must have been hundreds of items in there, all of them too small for any human to wear, and some were far more shrunken than others. It was a mismatched collection. Of course they're washing doll clothing, I thought, laughing aloud. Absolute nut jobs. Of course, I immediately sent pictures to my friends. "No way," Johnny replied. "Those two are so weird. I can't believe you're not babysitting actual humans. Didn't we play with their kids when we were growing up?" Sarah asked. "That's what I said to my parents," I replied. But they didn't think so. And Stephen and Susan said they don't have any children. "Oh, but they do," Johnny said. "Their beautiful baby washing machine." I snorted. "Also, I'm just thinking about the photos you sent," Johnny continued. "I think I recognize that teensy tiny t-shirt in the second picture. The one with the green turtle on it. See it? Oh my word, Tim wore that." "Well, a larger version of that," Sarah messaged. "Yeah, that name rings a bell," Johnny said. My heart dropped. Wait, Tim? Okay, this is getting weird now. I was part joking about them having kids, but that's the exact name I had in my head. Before my friends could respond, the doorbell rang. The sudden ding startled me, and my phone clattered to the tiles below, screen shattering dramatically. I groaned. Of course. I scooped up my wounded technological appendage, sighed at the screen I could no longer read, and placed the fallen soldier on the dining table. I stormed to the front of the house, ready to scowl at whoever had unwittingly caused my phone's demise. But when I flung the door open, nobody was there, though I was certain I could hear a faint wailing sound in the wind, as if a distant scream were striving to capture my attention. With a heavy sigh, I closed the door and returned to the kitchen, frustrated that a sizable portion of the night's earnings would be going towards fixing my phone screen. I squinted at the device's splintered screen, but it was useless. I couldn't read what my friends had replied. Suddenly, my attention diverted to an unusual noise from the washing machine's innards, a sound that was hard to distinguish, though it had some sort of subconscious effect on my body, lining my skin with a wave of goosebumps and upright hairs, much like the wailing wind at the front door. It sounded like a chorus of piercing shrieks. I knelt onto the kitchen tiles, sighing as my jeans pressed into shattered pieces of my phone screen, and stared deeply into the whirlpool of minuscule clothes which filled the washing machine. The rumble of the drum, the rustling of a tire, and the whooshes of water mostly drowned out the mysterious noise. But it was there. I hadn't imagined it. A choral pang of despair. And then I saw something which filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A fleshy creature, half the size of a pinky finger, slithered between two items of clothing. I yelled and immediately fell backwards, unable to pinpoint what I had seen, but entirely certain it was no insect, no animal. I hurriedly smashed every button on the washing machine, desperate to end the cycle. I'm not sure why my instinct wasn't to run. My brain wasn't functioning correctly. I waited a few minutes for the water to drain from the drum, watching the still pile of tiny outfits. My body shook violently, anticipating movement from within the clothing, but there was nothing. No fleshy monstrosity pounced out at me. And then there came the dreaded ding to signify that the door was safe to open. The drenched pile of clothes sat motionlessly, and I spent several minutes summoning the courage to rummage through it. The never-ending piercing sound was louder now. It was a muffled noise coming from the bottom of the clothes pile. I scarcely dared to look. Shrunken garments slipped through my fingers, and it was only upon closer inspection that I came to a horrifying realization. The outfits were stained with blood and some sort of indistinguishable mush. I could feel the vomit rising in my mouth, but I was as I uncovered the final layer of clothes at the bottom of the drum that I finally unloaded the contents of my stomach. A graveyard of flesh lay against the drum. There were hundreds of shrunken bodies, horribly disfigured, bloodied, and mushed. But the worst part was that some of the miniaturized victims were still moving. The indiscernible peach-colored things were people, and the piercing choral sound was that of their screaming. One of the less mangled people began to crawl over the smaller mound of clothes I'd created in the clearing. He was calling to me in a small, feeble voice. "Save us! Help!" he cried repeatedly. I watched in paralyzed fear, trying to decide whether it would be safe for me to reach the palm of my hand inside the drum to scoop out the few people still moving. The man who had wriggled free from the mound of bodies seemed wounded and helpless, but I was terrified of touching that horror scene. With a deep breath, I outstretched my hand, placing it palm side up on the clothes at the bottom. And as the tiny man, along with a few other survivors, clambered onto my skin, I tried to conceal the shivers that spread throughout my body. The first man continued to shout as I steadily lifted my hand closer to my ear, but I soon realized I'd misheard him the first time. "Not save us, help. Save yourself. What's happening?" I whispered weakly. "What? Didn't you see Grace outside?" The man screamed into my ear. My body shivered as I realized that must have been who rang the doorbell, the tiny voice I heard, wailing in the wind. "It doesn't matter now. Just find your coat and get out of here," he screeched in a minute voice. "Why do I need my coat?" I asked, gulping. "Because they'll shrink it to shrink you. I don't know how or why they do it, but it happened to all of us." I moved my hand to eye level, surveying the 6 survivors, 5 of whom were writhing on my palm. Only the main man seemed to be in any sort of fit state. Are you Tim?" I asked quietly. "What? Oh, the boy," he sighed. "No, the Halls put their children somewhere special. Never mind that. Come on, you need to find your coat." I looked at the clock on the wall. "Relax. It's 8 o'clock. They're not getting back until 11. They never went anywhere," the man screamed. In a near-synchronized manner, the house's lights extinguished. "Oh no," the small man whispered. They know. I'm getting out of here, I said, stumbling through the darkness. If you leave, that coat goes in the next cycle, and you become like us, the man warned. Or worse. And I didn't need to question what he meant. I'd seen the pulverized bodies at the bottom of the drum. Given the inexplicable nature of the tiny human in the palm of my hand, I had reason to believe every last word he'd said. So I made my way across the darkened entryway, opened the front door, and placed the miniature figures on the paving slabs. Go, I said. I could hear faint, pained sounds from the ground as the man said something inaudible to me, before helping his injured companions. Then I stepped back into the lightless house, pulling out my shattered phone to use the flashlight, thankfully. The screen still seemed to register my touch. Making my way up creaking stairs, the stillness of the house filled me with absolute terror, given I knew that the halls were lurking somewhere within those four walls. And when I reached the upstairs landing, a door opened at the far end. A darkened bedroom beckoned. I knew it to be a trap, but I had no choice, according to the small man I had saved. Not that I could trust him either. Stephen, Sarah? I called. I just want my coat, then I'll go. I stepped into a large, lightless children's room. There were 2 single beds and, most horrifyingly, a doll on each. Dolls that looked exactly like the 2 children I was completely certain I'd never imagined at all Tim and Rachel. But they weren't dolls. And they weren't alive. They seemed to have been shrunken and stuffed. I threw up on the floor, and the light in the house suddenly returned as Stephen and Susan entered the room through a side door. People are so weak these days, Stephen's voice growled. This generation sickens me. Susan sniffled. But not our children. They were pure. I cried. Why are you doing this to people? Why? Stephen frowned, frothing at the lips and brandishing my coat in his tight grip. To save our children, you ignorant fool. Your life will finally mean something. And seeing as you couldn't even wait for the next washing cycle, I guess we should head downstairs and start it now. You're insane, save them? Your children are dead. Look at what you've done to them, I cried, gesturing at the doll-sized, pale-faced corpses in the beds. Susan shrieked. Quiet, you foul thing. We didn't kill them. This was the only way to save them. Save your energy, honey, Stephen said, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. It's his turn now, and there's no running for him or his escaped friends. We'll catch them. We always do. Heart-pounding, an idea came to me. An idea so horrific that I didn't want to believe it had stemmed from my own brain. I stepped backwards and slammed the bedroom door closed. Then I turned on my heel and ran to the top of the stairs, ignoring the cackling sounds behind me. I scurried down the stairs, 2 at a time, and beelined for the coat stand by the door, scooping up 2 coats, one for Stephen and one for Susan. Hearing footsteps slowly plodding across the upstairs landing, I darted to the kitchen, realizing I had mere moments before I was caught. I threw the coats into the washing machine, ignoring the blood and guts within, and shut the door. It's useless, George, Stephen shouted, heading down the stairs. You won't find any weapons in this house. But you can run. Go for it. I pressed the start button and, in a stroke of genius, hammered the plastic handle off the door, preventing it from being opened. Stephen suddenly emerged in the kitchen doorway, coat in hand and frown on his face. What are you? He stopped mid-sentence and dropped the coat to the floor. No, Susan. I thought I might have to fight them off, allowing the cycle enough time to work its magic. But the horror commenced as soon as their coats began twirling in the running washing machine. As Stephen spun around in the doorway, his limbs began to crumple inwards, shrinking in a matter of seconds. He screamed in excruciating pain, as did Susan, who was still walking down the stairs. Parts of his skin tore and bled, as had been the case for most of the victims in the machine, and there sounded a series of thuds from the staircase. Stephen, mostly crippled and reduced to half of his size, ran out into the entryway, and I followed him. "No, Susan. Susan!" he cried, cradling his shrinking wife, who had tumbled to the floorboards and cracked her head open. "What have you done, you monster?" Stephen dropped his wife and turned his attention to me, charging with a furious glint in his eyes. I watched with a mixture of relief and horror as the man lunged forwards, shrinking as he went, and fell at my feet as a shriveled, pinky-sized, lifeless husk, wearing blood and guts on the outside of his corpse. I slumped to the floor of the entryway, eyeing the miniature corpses of the halls, making sure they were truly dead. And then, after an unknown period of time, I hazily walked into the kitchen, poured a bottle of vodka across the dining table, and set it ablaze with a lighter. The fire spread quickly. As I was walking towards the open front door, I noticed Stephen's wallet on a dresser. There was 80 pounds inside. Not quite enough for a new phone screen, and certainly not enough compensation for the horror I endured. But it sufficed. I wasn't willing to spend a moment longer in that house.